Now that Masahiro Sakurai has come out saying that Japanese developers should develop exclusively for Japan. We've seen a lot of people come out in support of him, grifters like Elon Musk and Grums, but I think it really needs to be understood, like from the community standpoint, that Nintendo has never publicly advocated for DEI. They've never done anything. They don't have diverse developers. They haven't been pandering to the modern audience. They've never advocated for that. Nintendo is and always has been based. And I would argue the inability to acknowledge that is a big, 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 big reason why the gaming community collapsed the way that it did, right? The reason we're getting Assassin's Creed Shadows and Concord is because gamers couldn't just pack up and leave PlayStation, Xbox, and PC the instant that things started going off the rails with the release of Mass Effect in 2008, right? 2007. The inability of gamers to acknowledge that Nintendo is the industry leader and has just been dominating when it comes to software and hardware development. It needs it had to be seen to be believed, right? Now, even in this era of people praising Sakurai, even right now that people are praising Masahiro Sakurai for coming out and speaking out against the westernification of Japanese games, there's this really underlying seed, this inability to accept that Nintendo has done more for gamers than any of these grifters. Way more than Grums, way more than Elon Musk. What have any of these people done to really make good, interesting video games other than seethe about other developers on Twitter, right? What have any of these people done? And meanwhile, Nintendo is putting out bangers near constantly, right? It's pretty much impossible to keep up with all of the great games coming out on Nintendo Switch right now. And to this day, you still have just this complete inability of the community to acknowledge this. Nintendo is on the verge of releasing a brand new console, and with one of their major players coming out and making this kind of statement, the guy behind Super Smash Bros., the series that literally is the public face of Nintendo, the future is clear at this point. Nintendo is not and never will go woke. And before people try to tell you that, well, Sakurai's going to retire and then Nintendo is going to succumb to the culture, the culture is going to die before that happens. We're seeing the culture die now. Okay, we are seeing more and more people in the general public become aware of the woke ideology and begin to reject it, right? It is going to be a slow, gradual process, obviously, but the seeds have already been set, and more and more people are starting to push back against concepts that have been ingrained into society for decades. Shit that you just weren't allowed to question. And and when it comes to something Nintendo versus the rest of the gaming industry, right? Nintendo is still this absolute banger of a company that's putting out that has all these great people working for them. Unlike the modern gaming industry, which has been a shit show for 30 years, right? Actually longer than that, right? People don't understand that Nintendo is poised to dominate the competition going forward. This idea that oh, Elden Ring, oh, Baldur's Gate 3, that's nothing but a cope, a deflection of what's actually happening. There are random Nintendo games that outperformed those games, right? Nintendo can put out bigger hits with on a fraction of the budget and the time, right? They can re-release games a decade later and have them become bestsellers. Just look at like what's going on now with Xenoblade Chronicles X, right? There is simply nothing anybody in the industry can do to stop what's going to happen with the Switch 2. Where like this company is going to swoop in and dominate because of people like Masahiro Sakurai. And meanwhile, Grums is gonna sit there just seething, like, well, we would be doing great too if it wasn't for woke culture. No, this issue has nothing to do with woke culture. When you study the history of Nintendo, you really understand just how much work and how much time it's taken to get them in the position they are now. Hiroshi Yamauchi apparently understood that expanding to the Nintendo market expanding Nintendo to the American market was essential to the growth of the business in the 60s, right? And what happened? Donkey Kong, the NES took over from the after the Atari downfall, crashed the gaming industry here. Nintendo became big in America. The N64 did the best in America, right? And people love to say that's just like a cope, like, oh, it only did well in America. Yeah, it did well in the biggest market, right? It's like people don't understand what a big deal that actually is, right? This is why we still talk about like Mario 64 and Ocarina of Time today, while Final Fantasy 7 and Metal Gear Solid have fallen off, right? Why nobody talks about the Saturn anymore, right? The N64 was competitive in the biggest market, right? And that led to the Nintendo Revolution with the Wii, with the DS, and where we're at now, where essentially the only people who hate Nintendo in the new 20s, right, in 2025, are people who have just spent like the past 30 years seething about them, right? Like, and this is the natural result of and this is like the core problem with like the modern gaming industry, right? Like just an inability to accept like where the talent actually is and where the good games are coming from. They'll give you some vague like claim that like, oh, the best games come from Japan, completely unwilling to admit what company is based in Japan, the most famous Japanese video game company, the only one that is still based in Japan. Like, what is so difficult to understand about this? Like, it always has been a gigantic cope, seeing these people just sit there and seethe about like, about games getting worse while like refusing to admit the actual problem, right? While refusing to admit that like budgets are out of control, that they're not cultivating talent, that they're not creating new IP, while like simultaneously like, accusing Nintendo of like doing all those things but worse, like just this year, right? There was a big push to like gaslight fans into thinking that like Nintendo was censoring third-party games, which is not and never has been true, right? But that's all they have, are just narratives, Like, oh, they don't make new IPs. Oh, they censor games. Oh, their games are casualized. None of that is true, but like that's all they got, right? So they kind of cling on to that mindset like very, very desperately. And when it comes to like the woke culture war, when it comes to like the downfall of gaming, even at this juncture, even as woke culture lies defeated and we're all moving on into a glorious future, right? Grums is still sitting there on Twitter trying to convince you that like Nintendo of America, they're gonna make your games woke. Like, they're a marketing and distribution firm. Okay, they don't make the games. And that's been like, anybody who knew anything about the company knows that. And yet, like, that's been like a pretty persistent narrative for at least the past decade, right? There is this there is this very strong unwillingness among the community, especially among older people, to acknowledge that Nintendo is a genuinely well-run company. There's this refusal to admit that Nintendo won the console war, that they have the most iconic brands, that they're branching out into spheres outside of gaming, that there will be no like glorious downfall for them. They have ingrained themselves into culture at this point. Like there's just this complete refusal to admit any of that because that would be admitting that all of them backed the wrong horse. You know, they all believed in the third party developers. They all believed in the Western gaming space. They all believed in like PlayStation, Xbox, and PC. And all of that has now bent the knee to Nintendo.